For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 757. Now, that's the North Korea Sanctions Enforcement Act of 2015, as amended.
Will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 757, a bill to improve the enforcement of sanctions against the government of North Korea and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous materials on this resolution.
Without objection.
Thank you. I also ask unanimous consent to place into the record exchanges of letters between myself and the chairman of the other 4 committees of referral.
Without objection.
Thank you, Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Speaker, I appreciate Leader McCarthy working with myself, working with Ranking Member Elliott Engel of New York to schedule this legislation for floor consideration. Last week, North Korea conducted its 4th known nuclear test. The Kim regime has developed increasingly destructive weapons. And what we're concerned about here is the miniaturization of nuclear warheads that fit onto its most reliable missiles. We're also concerned about the submarine tests for firing from a sub, these missiles that would be capable of launching those devices. And we're concerned about the ongoing efforts to make certain that they've got the range now to, on a 3-stage rocket, ICBM, to hit the United States. This threat is unacceptable, and it has to be aggressively challenged. The legislation that we're considering here is the most comprehensive North Korea sanctions legislation to come before this body. Importantly, what this bill does is use targeted financial and economic pressure to isolate Kim Jong-un and his top officials from the assets that they maintain in foreign banks and from the hard currency that sustains their rule. These assets are derived primarily from illicit activities, such as counterfeiting U.S. currency, something that North Korea has been caught doing with $100 banknotes, such as selling their missile systems around the world, contraband in cigarettes and drugs and other illicit activities. And all of that is used to advance North Korea's nuclear program. They also pay for the luxurious lifestyle of the ruling elites, as we've seen in some of the exposés that come out of North Korea, and it's used to repress the people. In other words, the money from that hard currency pays for the generals, pays for the secret police, pays for the missile program and the nuclear weapons program. A strategy of financial pressure is the approach we took a decade ago when the previous administration targeted Banco Delta Asia. That was a Macau-based bank. This was in 2005. They were targeted for their role in laundering money for North Korea, and this cut it off from the financial system, really. And this led other banks in the region to shun North Korean business, because when the option is out there between whether or not you're going to bank with North Korea or bank with the U.S. and the rest of the world, it's a fairly easy choice for these banks to make. At that point, they freeze the accounts, and that obviously isolates the regime. And that at that time, according to one former top U.S. official who was speaking to the issue of what the North Koreans would say when they would come into the meetings with the State Department, at every conversation we had with the North Koreans, he said, every one of them began and ended with the same question: when do we get our money back? Now, the part that got my interest at the time was not only the report that because he couldn't pay his generals, there was problems for the regime. It's not a good position for a dictator to be in, but also that missile production lines had come to a halt because they couldn't buy on the black market. They didn't have the hard currency anymore to do it, the parts that they needed for their programs. Unfortunately, that pressure at the time was lifted. I think it was lifted prematurely, for certain, because the representation was made that Kim Jong-il was going to make concessions on his nuclear program, concessions that ultimately were never made. From my standpoint, what a mistake. From the standpoint of the people I talked to over at Treasury, what a mistake. They had a different vision on how those sanctions should be maintained. And today, the Obama administration has let its North Korea policy drift. A year ago, it promised a proportional response to the massive cyber terrorist attack against the United States. But to date, the administration's response has been dangerously weak. A mere 18 low-level arms dealers have been sanctioned. That's been it. Failing to respond to North Korea's belligerence, I think, only emboldens their leader. Disrupting North Korea's illicit activities will place tremendous strain on that country's ruling elite, who have so brutalized the people of North Korea. I spoke to the defector who used to run their propaganda machinery about this. He defected through China. And he discussed this issue. He said, look, that hard currency goes not to the people. It goes for the military apparatus and the political apparatus of the regime. So we've got to go after those illicit activities like we went after organized crime in the United States. Identify the network, interdict shipments, disrupt the flow of money. North Korea, after all, has been called a gangster regime. You've seen that term in the press. Well, it's pretty apt. This regime is a critical threat, frankly, to our national security. And under this bill's framework, anyone laundering money, counterfeiting goods, smuggling, or trafficking narcotics will be subject to significant sanctions. It is also important to remember the deplorable state of human rights in North Korea. 2 years ago, a UN Commission of Inquiry released the most comprehensive report on North Korea to date, finding that the Kim regime has, for decades in their words, pursued policies involving crimes that shock the conscience of humanity. So this bill requires the State Department to use this report's findings to identify the individuals responsible for these abuses and to press for more ways in which to get information into North Korea so as to move the attitudes of the population inside the country. Mr. Speaker, a return to the strategy of effective financial pressure on North Korea is our best bet to end North Korea's threat to its own people, to our South Korean allies, and ultimately to us. And I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this measure, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I want to first thank our chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Ed Royce, for authoring this very good bipartisan bill. I'm very pleased to be the lead Democratic co-sponsor. I think this is an important bill, and it ties in with what we've tried to do for these past years on the Foreign Affairs Committee, being bipartisan and letting politics stop at the water's edge when we're talking about international affairs. Mr. Speaker, last week's nuclear test in North Korea was a stark reminder of just how dangerous the Kim regime is. A nuclear weapon in the hands of a rogue power is a threat to peace and stability around the world. North Korea continues to have a destabilizing influence on the peninsula and across the region, and the potential for nuclear fuel from North Korea to end up on the black market and in the hands of violent extremists only compounds the threat. Yet despite the burden of some of the toughest sanctions imaginable, despite constant pressure from the global community, Despite the increasing isolation of North Korea from the rest of the world, leaders in Pyongyang persist on this dangerous and destabilizing course. The latest test demands a response. We need to work with our allies, particularly South Korea and Japan. We need to make sure this issue is at the top of the agenda in our engagement with China. China can have a lot of influence and does have a lot of influence over North Korea. And we need to act unilaterally to make clear to the North Koreans that their actions have consequences. This bill would broaden our sanctions and strengthen enforcement. And let me say, I'm very proud again, in a bipartisan way, this bill passed unanimously out of the Foreign Affairs Committee. North Korea has become more and more savvy at evading sanctions, and that's why this bill broadens our sanctions. The country's elites do business with shell companies and cover up the money trail. This allows hard currency to flow into North Korea. This bill would crack down on this practice and go after anyone helping to prop up the Kim regime through these illegal activities. I must say that I have been to North Korea twice, to Pyongyang twice. And we watched in the morning when people were going to work. The elites do very well there. It's just the rest of the country that's starving. And of course, this bill would include the important exceptions for the humanitarian aid that benefits the North Korean people. We help them with food aid. We are the most generous country with feeding North Korea. It's important to point this out because our quarrel is not with the North Korean people. It's with the despot and his aides that run North Korea. We know that the people of North Korea endure deplorable treatment at the hands of a corrupt regime. I can tell you the country's citizens deserve much, much better. That's why we'll keep up the pressure on North Korea's leaders, and that's why we need to pass this legislation. So I urge a yes vote, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the distinguished chairman for yielding, and I rise in strong support of H.R. 757, the North Korea Sanctions Enforcement Act of 2016. Mr. Speaker, there is a compelling need to pass tough and effective legislation to freeze the assets of the Kim Jong-un regime. I want to commend Chairman Royce for his long and hard work on North Korea and his determination to bring this bill to the floor. And again, thank Ranking Member Elliot Engel for his good, strong sense of bipartisanship. This is a 1-2 punch against a cruel dictatorship, and this legislation has to get to the President as soon as possible. Mr. Speaker, whether it be North Korea or Iran, when will we learn the hard lesson that totalitarian states do not negotiate in good faith, cannot be trusted to hold up their end of the bargain, and use our goodwill and our foreign capital to keep on proliferating? They will not allow intrusive inspections because they cheat and because it weakens their status at home. They use nuclear weapons negotiations to enhance their own diplomatic status and to gain concessions. In the end, nuclear negotiations earn rogue nations like Iran and North Korea foreign capital and other investments from the West. They use that to fund additional missile technology, to fund criminal and terrorist activities, and to continue with clandestine nuclear programs. During the Bush administration, the most effective tools in bringing the North Korea dictatorship to heel was the freezing of its assets in the Banco Delta Asia in Macau and the building of an international coalition to interdict suspect North Korea shipping. These should be our priorities now, especially in the shadow of North Korea's nuclear tests, and by imposing mandatory sanctions on the perpetrators of human rights abuses, censorship, arms and human trafficking, money laundering, as well as proliferation. Nearly 2 years ago, the UN Commission of Inquiry reported that the ongoing crimes against humanity in North Korea have, quote, no parallel in the contemporary world. These crimes include extermination, murder, enslavement, torture, imprisonment, rape, forced abortions, and other sexual violence, persecutions of political, religious, and racial and gender grounds, the forcible transfer of populations, the enforced disappearance of persons, and the inhumane act of knowingly causing prolonged starvation. Kim Jong-il cares not at all about the welfare of his own people. We should expect that he cares even less about the welfare of the people of Japan, South Korea, or even U.S. citizens who face the threat of North Korean nuclear weapons. The UN Commission recommended that the UN impose targeted sanctions on the North Korean leaders responsible for its human rights crimes. However, China blocks UN action. Without UN action, the U.S. must act, using our position as the steward of the global financial system. The UN Special Envoy on North Korea welcomes such action, supporting targeted sanctions
Gentleman's
against
time's
those
expired.
most responsible for these heinous crimes against humanity. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California.
I yield 3. I'll continue to reserve.
The gentleman
Mr.
reserves.
Speaker.
The gentleman from New York.
I now yield 2 minutes to my friend and colleague, a valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Connolly. Two minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my dear friend from New York, the distinguished ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and I rise today in support of the North Korea Sanctions Enforcement Act of 2015. And I want to thank the chairman and ranking member for their leadership in bringing this legislation before us. I especially appreciate the inclusion of 2 of my amendments, one to provide for the reunification of Korean families separated by the 38th parallel, and another to ensure that U.S. policy toward North Korea is informed by the recommendations made by the Landmark Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea conducted by the United Nations. Amidst the tense geopolitical standoffs and irresponsible actions of the North Korea regime, we must always remember the human cost to this enduring conflict. And I believe this bill, through these amendments and important exceptions to sanctions for humanitarian relief organizations, does just that. This is timely, if not overdue, legislation. North Korea is a reckless, paranoid state devoid of virtually all aspects of human autonomy, now armed with a nuclear umbrella. That makes the Korean Peninsula one of the most dangerous flashpoints in the globe. There have been recent developments in North Korea that are profoundly troubling and deserve an immediate response from this Congress. Reports that North Korea has conducted its 4th nuclear weapons test confirm that the regime in Pyongyang is committed to defying international norms and risks destabilizing the entire Asia-Pacific region. As co-chairman of the Congressional Caucus in Korea, I remain deeply concerned with the volatility and ever-present potential of conflict on the Korea Peninsula. It's a specter that looms over 75 million Koreans, and for their sake and that of the region, the U.S., the Republic of Korea, and China, and other regional stakeholders must demonstrate commitment to addressing this threat. By targeting the individuals and entities that support the Kim regime through illicit activities, this bill will hopefully weaken the resolve and capability of Pyongyang to endanger regional stability. I urge passage of the bill.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from New York.
Thank you.
There's a gentleman from New York reserved.
I'm
sorry, I reserved. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Judge Ted Poe, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade. He's also an original co-sponsor with me on this legislation.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the Speaker and I thank the Chairman and the Ranking Member for bringing this piece of legislation up to the House floor. Mr. Speaker, North Korea is a world threat, a nuclear world threat. Its leaders are outlaws with no redeeming social character in their souls, and we need to operate with them knowing this. Last week, North Korea tested another nuclear weapon. And as chairman of the Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade Subcommittee, I held a hearing in October and predicted that this test would happen again. With Iran about to receive hundreds of billions of dollars for its illegal nuclear program, we shouldn't be surprised that North Korea wants a piece of the pie, too. Illegal nuclear programs and material can bring a lot of money to a regime. In the hearing that we had in October, we learned of deep connections between Iran and North Korea. Both nations, among other things, sponsor worldwide terror. They have a history of working together on missile development. There is mounting evidence that they have worked together on their nuclear weapon programs as well. We should expect Iran to keep working with North Korea to advance its own nuclear weapon program. We have sanctions on North Korea, but all those sanctions haven't been fully implemented. The administration's policy of strategic patience is not working because this barbaric regime continues to develop nuclear weapons and ICBM. I say our patience has run out in dealing with them. This bill is Congress showing that North Korea that there are consequences for their testing of nuclear weapons. We cannot let North Korea develop its nuclear program even more. North Korea already has submarines with missiles on them that can reach the United States, over 10 nuclear bombs, and for some reason has Austin on its hit list. I take that personal, Mr. Speaker, that Austin is their #1 target in the United States. North Korea is a state that imprisons Christians for their faith, stars its citizens, controls the internet, the media, tortures anyone in its domain who dares to disagree with the regime, and is engaged in cyber terrorism. Dangerous actions by a ruthless dictator must be met by forceful responses. I'm glad to be an original co-sponsor of this bill. I urge its passage. It's time for them to pay the price for going rogue. And that's just the way it is. I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from New York.
It's my pleasure now to yield 4 minutes to our colleague on the Foreign Affairs Committee, a rising star in our committee, Tulsi Gabbard. 4 minutes.
The gentlewoman from Hawaii is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today in strong support of H.R. 757, this North Korea Sanctions Enforcement Act, which I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of. North Korea continues to pose a serious and dangerous threat to my constituents in Hawaii, the Pacific, and the West Coast of the United States. Our communities, our families lie within range of North Korea's intercontinental ballistic missiles. North Korea's nuclear test just a week ago and their continued pursuit of developing more nuclear weapons and miniaturizing those weapons serve as a reminder of the threat that North Korea poses to our country, which my constituents in Hawaii know all too well. There are some necessary steps that the United States must take to deal with this threat. We need to increase the strength and capabilities of our Pacific Fleet and forces. We need to stop the downward trend in investment of ballistic missile defense development and capabilities and strengthen our ballistic missile defense capabilities, specifically in Hawaii and the Pacific, to counter this threat. We need to completely re-examine our strategy of so-called strategic patience with North Korea, recognizing that North Korea has continued to grow in their nuclear and missile capabilities, telling us that the status quo is not working. This bill, however, deals with another important area where we need to act, and that is sanctions. It gives us the tools to respond to North Korea's provocations. One provision would apply sanctions that prohibit the export of munitions to North Korea and severely restrict export licenses for controlled goods and technologies. It would prohibit financial transactions between U.S. persons and the government of North Korea and sanction those who send or receive lethal military equipment to North Korea. The bill will also give us the tools to reapply some of the most effective sanctions that we've ever had against hard currency for those who do business with North Korea. We saw how these sanctions were effective before. Following U.S. action against the Banco Delta Asia based in Macau in 2005, the assets of North Korean banks and leaders were frozen and completely blocked from the international financial system. This directly affected the money being used to develop these nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities, and it also supported the regime's leadership and its elites and their lifestyle. This severely increased the pressure in North Korea, causing them to engage in the international community, coming to an agreement to lift the sanctions in 2007, prematurely in my view, made in exchange for shutting down and sealing the Yongbyon nuclear facilities and to discussing a list of its nuclear-related activities with the U.S. and other parties in the region. The agreement was violated by North Korea in 2009 when they tested a missile And the sanctions on Banco Delta showed us earlier on a way to impact North Korean leadership and business directly. Now, those sanctions should have been immediately reinstated upon North Korea breaking that agreement, but that's why we're here today to act. While sanctions alone are not enough, this bill could provide some very important tools to countering North Korea's aggression and ultimately achieving our objective of a denuclearized North Korea. Lastly, this bill recognizes the terrible human rights abuses inflicted on the people of North Korea. For many years, State Department human rights reports, as well as private organizations' reports, have depicted a pattern of extreme human rights abuses by the tyrannical North Korean regime, including the denial of basic human freedoms, withheld access to food, deplorable prison camps where extrajudicial killings, enslavement, torture, and sexual abuse are widespread. I'd like to thank our Chairman Royce, our Ranking Member Engel for their steadfast bipartisan dedication and leadership to taking action on this global and domestic security issue. This bill provides a critical step forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Ross-Leitonen, Chairman Emeritus of the Foreign Affairs Committee and author of multiple North Korea human rights and sanctions laws. She's also a co-sponsor of this bill.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm so proud and pleased to be here speaking on behalf of this bill, H.R. 757, the North Korea Sanctions Enforcement Act, and thank Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel for introducing this important bill, which once again is presented in the usual bipartisan manner. While initial reports, Mr. Speaker, cast doubt on North Korea's claims that it carried out a hydrogen bomb test, any enhancement of the regime's nuclear capability must be a cause for concern. Both U.S. and South Korean intelligence assessments indicate that North Korea already possesses the capability to install a nuclear warhead on a missile that can reach United States territory or that of our allies. And despite some doubt about that capability's effectiveness, it is just a matter of time before North Korea finishes developing this dangerous technology that it's seeking, or worse, shares this technology with Iran, as these two rogue regimes are bosom buddies and have long been known to collaborate on their ballistic missile programs. What is clear is that our current policy toward North Korea is not working. Administrations from both parties, Mr. Speaker, have made mistakes with North Korea over the years. They've failed to respond to North Korea's violation of its nuclear deal and have failed to hold the regime accountable for its illicit activity. Administration after administration, they will remove North Korea off the state sponsor of terrorism and continue to keep the regime off that list despite mounting evidence that would support its inclusion back on the terrorism list. And various administrations have utterly failed to enforce the North Korea sanctions that we already have on the books. The Obama administration's so-called strategic patience policy with North Korea has proven to be a disaster, and it is time that we fully and vigorously enforce the existing sanctions, expand upon those to implement new sanctions on Pyongyang until its nuclear program is dismantled. By some estimates, North Korea might already have 10 to 15 nuclear weapons, and Kim Jong-un has shown that he will stop at nothing to get the weapons and the technology that he desires. This bill would help ensure that our sanctions on North Korea are finally being enforced the way they always should have been. But we can't forget that North Korea cannot make progress on its nuclear program alone. North Korea has a long history of collaborating with other rogue regimes, and we must ensure that we are enforcing sanctions on all of its collaborators. Any government, entity, or individual that has sold or transferred weapons or technology to North Korea in violation of U.S. law or UN Security Council resolution should also be targeted for sanctions. Mr. Speaker, I will end with this note. North Korea has been writing the playbook for rogue regimes to follow, and unless this administration gets serious about confronting Pyongyang's aggressions, I worry that it will continue to allow Iran to take advantage of us, that we won't enforce sanctions on Tehran, just like we're not enforcing them on North Korea. And in a few years' time, if I could have 30 seconds, Mr. Chairman.
I yield an additional minute to the gentlelady.
Thank you, sir.
Second.
And that in a few years' time, we will be back here debating what to do after another nuclear device test by North Korea, by Iran, or other rogue actors. North Korea poses an imminent threat now to our security as well as that to our allies, and we cannot afford to ignore it nor look the other way. I urge all of my colleagues to vote for this important bill and urge its passage. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the chairman and I thank the ranking member for this bill. Thank you, sir.
The leader yields. The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from New York.
May I ask the chairman, are there any more speakers on the other side?
No other speakers. I would just close.
Okay, thank you. I have no other speakers, too, so I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
For the purposes of closing. Colleagues, a nuclear weapon in the hands of North Korea, a rogue, destabilizing country on the peninsula and across the region, is simply a non-starter. It's unthinkable. Despite our tough sanctions and increasing isolation from the global community, Pyongyang continues down a dangerous and destabilizing course. Last week's nuclear test in North Korea is a jarring reminder of just how dangerous the Kim regime is and demands a response from the United States and from our allies as well. We must work with South Korea and Japan to make sure this issue is at the top of our agenda in our engagement with China. We must act unilaterally to make sure to North Koreans that their leadership's actions have consequences. H.R. 757 would broaden our sanctions and strengthen enforcement. The bill would crack down on North Korean elite who do business through shell companies to evade detection and go after anyone helping to prop up the Kim regime through illegal activities. And this bill would include important exceptions for the humanitarian aid that benefits the North Korean people. North Koreans deserve much more than what its leaders are providing, which is why we need to pass this legislation. We cannot allow North Korea to continue to be dangerous and frivolous. We have to stand up and say no. They have to understand that we mean business. They have to understand that what they've done is unacceptable and will not stand. I urge my colleagues to support this measure, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields the balance of his time. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
We have the opportunity today to show Americans and the world that Congress is willing to lead on this vital national security issue. This is an issue that Congress has been focused on, obviously, for some time, and I've spent much of my time on the Foreign Affairs Committee focused on the North Korea threat. Ranking Member Eliot Engel and I, in one of our first trips together as chairman and ranking member of the committee, we traveled to visit our South Korean ally, and we toured the wreckage of the Chonan. Now, this was a corvette, a ship, that was hit and split right in half by a torpedo fired by a North Korean submarine. And it cost the lives of some 46 sailors. It's a reminder of the attitude that North Korea has in terms of its provocative action. Both Eliot Engel and I have been in North Korea on separate trips, and we can tell you it is a totalitarian state with an ever-present cult of personality. If you've ever read 1984, Orwell's book, the society in that book seemed almost more rational than this police state in which, as I was talking to the former Minister of Propaganda, 1.9 million people in the no-go areas were starved to death in North Korea. And when you ask why, well, with the paranoia of the police state, they're not considered particularly loyal out there. Besides, the food can be sold on the food exchange in the capital for hard currency. Donated food often is used in this way to support what he calls juche, which support this philosophy which leads them forward with this desire to have a nuclear weapon and the capability to deliver it. So, This bipartisan bill, which I authored with Elliot Engel as our principal co-author, is based on legislation that unanimously passed the House last Congress. Its implementation will help sever a key subsidy for North Korea's weapons of mass destruction program. For only when the North Korean leadership realizes that its criminal activities are untenable do prospects for peace and security in Northeast Asia improve. This bill will return us to the one strategy that has worked to pressure North Korea at a time when Kim Jong-un is trying to blackmail his way to consolidating power. Congress must send the message to the Kim regime that he can either reform and disarm or his system can implode. And without hard currency, without being able to pay his generals, that system would implode. By cutting off Kim Jong-un's access to the hard currency he needs for his armies and his weapons, this bill, H.R. 757, will squarely present the North Korean regime with that choice. And I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yields the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 757 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the...
Mr. Speaker, on that, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.